The first thing the slave noticed was the smell. Not the blood. Not the bodies. The wood. Freshly cut pine baking beneath the Roman sun. Even before he saw the crosses lining the road ahead, he already knew where they were taking him. Because everybody in the empire knew that smell. It drifted for miles outside Roman cities like a warning from the gods themselves. A message nailed into the earth. Obey, or end up here. His wrists were tied so tightly the rope had already peeled the skin raw. Every stumble forced the fibers deeper into flesh. But the guards didn't slow down. Roman soldiers rarely looked at condemned men once the sentence was final. To them, he wasn't a person anymore. Just another body moving toward a public spectacle. And that was the point. Crucifixion was never designed merely to kill someone. Rome had far easier ways to execute people. Faster ways. Cleaner ways. A sword through the neck took seconds. Even burning alive was quicker. Crucifixion existed for something else entirely. It was theater. A performance of terror. The empire wanted crowds to watch a human being slowly transformed into meat and silence. They wanted children to see it, merchants to pass by it, travelers to smell it from the road. Rome didn't simply punish rebellion. Rome displayed it. And for slaves, the punishment was even worse. Because a slave in ancient Rome wasn't considered fully human under the law. They were property, living tools, a speaking object. If a mule kicked its owner, it was beaten. If a slave resisted, it was crucified. Sometimes hundreds at a time. The man stumbling down that dusty road understood this long before the soldiers shoved him forward. Somewhere behind him, miles away now, was the estate where he had spent most of his life. Maybe he had worked the fields. Maybe the mines. Maybe the kitchens of a wealthy Roman villa. History rarely recorded the names of men like him. But Rome recorded their deaths. Especially after revolts. Especially after fear spread through the empire. And no event terrified Rome more than what happened after Spartacus. When the slave rebellion finally collapsed in 71 BC, the Roman general Crassus ordered 6,000 captured slaves crucified along the Appian Way. Imagine that for a second. Not 6,000 buried. Not 6,000 executed quickly. 6,000 crosses. Stretching mile after mile after mile beside one of the busiest roads in the world. Travelers walking toward Rome would pass endless rows of dying men twisting beneath the sun. Some still screaming. Some begging for water. Some too broken even to move. Birds gathered before they were fully dead. The smell reportedly lingered for weeks. That was Rome's message to the world. This is what happens when slaves forget their place. And now this man was about to become part of that message. The soldiers finally stopped near a cleared patch beside the road where several upright beams already stood planted in the earth. Some held bodies. Others waited empty. Crows hopped casually through the dirt between them. One of the men hanging nearby was still alive. The slave heard him before he looked up. A strange choking noise. What? Rhythmic. Desperate. When he finally raised his eyes, the horror became impossible to ignore. The crucified man's chest convulsed violently every few seconds as he struggled to breathe. His shoulders looked dislocated. Blood streaked down both arms. Flies covered his face so heavily he barely resembled a human being anymore. And the terrifying part? He probably still had hours left. Maybe days. Modern people often imagine crucifixion as a quick death from blood loss. It usually wasn't. The Romans perfected it specifically to prolong suffering. Victims could linger for astonishing lengths of time depending on how they were positioned. Some died from shock. Some from dehydration. Some from heart failure. Many suffocated slowly, because hanging from extended arms places unbearable pressure on the chest. Every breath becomes work. To inhale, the condemned man had to push upward against nailed or bound feet just to lift his body enough for air. Then exhaustion dragged him back down again. Up for breath. Down for agony. Again and again. For hours. Sometimes days. The slaves staring at those crosses probably understood all of this instantly. Crucifixion wasn't rare in Rome. Public executions were entertainment. People gathered to watch them the way crowds gather around accidents today. Children pointed. Vendors sold food nearby. Philosophers even wrote about how useful crucifixion was for maintaining social order. Seneca once described victims writhing on crosses in grotesque detail, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions while they begged for death. This was civilization, Roman style. The soldiers untied the slave's wrists only to force a heavy wooden beam onto his shoulders. Historians believe many condemned prisoners carried the crossbeam themselves to the execution site. Not the full cross like movies often show. Just the horizontal beam, already stained dark from previous executions. It could weigh over 100 pounds. By now his back was likely shredded. Roman floggings alone could kill people before crucifixion even began. Soldiers used whips embedded with bone fragments or metal balls designed to tear skin apart. Ancient accounts describe flesh hanging in ribbons, muscle exposed, bones visible, and Rome preferred victims conscious. Pain was part of the spectacle. As the slave staggered forward beneath the timber, crowds probably gathered along the roadside. Some mocked him. Some watched silently. Others ignored him completely. That might be the darkest part of Roman crucifixion. Not everyone reacted with horror. For many citizens, this was normal, ordinary, necessary, because Rome functioned through hierarchy and fear. Nearly a third of Italy's population at certain points may have been enslaved. Think about how unstable that made the empire. Wealthy Romans slept each night surrounded by people they had conquered, bought, beaten, or inherited. Entire estates relied on slave labor. Fear of uprising infected everything. That's why Roman punishments became so theatrical. A private execution couldn't terrify millions. A cross beside a crowded road could. The soldiers shoved him onto the ground. Dust filled his mouth. Some victims were tied to crosses. Others were nailed. The Romans used both methods depending on how much suffering they wanted to inflict. Nails weren't usually driven through the palms like later artwork depicted. Human palms tear too easily under body weight. Archaeological evidence suggests the spikes were often hammered through the wrists instead, crushing nerves along the way. The pain would have been indescribable. One Roman writer compared severe nerve pain to fire spreading through the body. Except this fire never stopped. The slave likely fought when the soldiers grabbed his arm. Almost everyone did. Survival instinct takes over even when escape is impossible. But Roman execution teams were experienced, efficient. They had performed this ritual countless times before. One soldier pinned the arm. Another positioned the spike. Then came the hammer. Ancient sources rarely describe the sound directly, but maybe that's because nobody needed to. Anyone near a crucifixion understood what it meant instantly. Iron through flesh. Wood beneath bone. One strike rarely finished the job. The victim screamed. Or maybe he didn't. Some people fainted immediately from shock. Others lost their voices after prolonged torture. But consciousness usually returned eventually. Pain has a way of dragging people awake. Then the second hand. Then the feet. There's debate among historians about exactly how Roman victims were positioned. Some crosses were shaped like a T. Others resembled the traditional image recognized today. Feet might be nailed separately or together. Sometimes victims sat partially on small wooden pegs to prolong survival. You heard that correctly. The Romans occasionally added seats to crosses. Not for comfort. To prevent death from happening too quickly. The goal wasn't execution. The goal was domination. And once the slave was finally lifted upright, the real horror began. Because now there was nothing left to distract him. No marching. No struggling. No uncertainty. Just waiting. Imagine the heat first. Mediterranean sun beating directly onto torn flesh for hour after hour. Sweat flowing into open wounds. Flies swarming instantly. Muscles cramping uncontrollably as the body strained against gravity. Then thirst. Victims became desperately dehydrated. Lips cracked. Tongues swelled. Some hallucinated. Ancient accounts mention condemned men begging passers-by for water, mercy, anything at all. Most received laughter instead. And all the while, people kept walking past. That's important to understand. Crucifixion happened in public spaces intentionally. Rome wanted maximum visibility. Merchants hauling goods to market would pass dying slaves hanging overhead. Soldiers returning from campaigns saw them. Families traveling roads with children saw them too. The empire embedded fear into daily life. One historian described crucifixion as a language of power. Every body hanging beside a road communicated the same sentence without words. Rome owns you. The slave's breathing grew harder as hours passed. This part becomes terrifyingly physical when you understand what the body experiences during suspension. Hanging by the arms slowly compresses the chest muscles until breathing becomes exhausting labor. Carbon dioxide builds up. Panic rises. Every instinct screams for air. So the victim pushes upward with damaged legs to inhale. Then collapses downward again from pain and fatigue. Over and over. Eventually many victims became too weak to lift themselves anymore. That's when suffocation truly began. And yet death could still take astonishingly long. There are accounts of crucified prisoners surviving multiple days. Think about the psychological torment of that. Watching night fall while still alive. Watching sunrise again. Hearing conversations below you. Feeling insects crawl across your wounds while your hands remain pinned in place. Some victims went mad. Others became strangely quiet. Roman soldiers sometimes gambled beneath the crosses while they waited for prisoners to die. Execution duty could last hours, even days. Guards needed entertainment. To them, the suffering overhead eventually became background noise. That detail alone reveals something chilling about Rome. Extreme cruelty doesn't always require monsters. Sometimes it only requires repetition. A system. Enough exposure to pain and human beings adapt disturbingly fast. The slave hanging beside the road may have watched birds land on nearby corpses. Romans often denied proper burials to crucified criminals. Bodies could remain exposed long after death as additional warnings. Dogs scavenged them. Crows tore at exposed flesh. For enslaved people, this fear mattered deeply. In many ancient cultures, burial rites carried enormous spiritual importance. To die unburied wasn't merely humiliating. It threatened the soul itself. Rome weaponized that fear too. And then came the moment every crucified victim eventually faced. The realization that nobody was coming. At first, some prisoners begged for rescue. Others shouted curses at the crowd. Some promised money. Some prayed. But crucifixion stripped hope away slowly, piece by piece. Friends disappeared. Crowds lost interest. Daylight faded. Pain remained. Imagine hanging there as evening approached, body trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion. The road grows quieter. The air cools slightly. Somewhere in the distance, people are eating dinner beside warm fires while you remain nailed to wood waiting for your lungs to fail. The empire continues calmly around you. That may have been Rome's greatest psychological weapon. Crucifixion transformed human suffering into scenery. And yet something strange happened over time. The very punishment Rome used to display absolute power eventually became associated with its greatest humiliation. Because one crucifixion changed history forever. Not because crucifixion itself was unusual. It was horrifyingly common. But because of who the Romans executed and what his followers claimed afterward. Jesus of Nazareth died the death of a slave. That's the part many people forget. In Roman eyes, crucifixion was considered so degrading that citizens were usually protected from it except in extreme cases like treason. The punishment belonged primarily to slaves, rebels, pirates, and society's lowest classes. Cicero called crucifixion the cruelest and most disgusting penalty imaginable. Respectable people weren't supposed to even discuss it openly, and yet Christianity eventually transformed the cross into a symbol recognized across the world. Imagine how shocking that would have seemed to Romans at the time. Taking the empire's ultimate symbol of terror and turning it into something sacred. It would be like modern civilizations wearing electric chairs around their necks as jewelry. The reversal was astonishing. But for the slave dying beside the road, none of that future mattered yet. His world remained painfully physical. By now his shoulders were likely partially dislocated from prolonged suspension. Blood circulation slowed. Severe cramping seized the legs and abdomen. Every breath arrived harder than the last. The body enters survival panic during suffocation. Victims become frantic. Instinct overrides dignity. Some crucified prisoners reportedly pushed upward violently against nails just to inhale for a few more seconds. Anything for air. Roman executioners sometimes accelerated death by breaking the victim's legs with heavy clubs. Without leg support, pushing upward became impossible. Suffocation followed quickly afterward. Imagine hearing soldiers approach carrying those clubs. Imagine understanding exactly why. Some victims likely prayed for the blow. Others feared it. Either way, Rome controlled the ending. What's terrifying is how advanced the empire became at managing suffering. Crucifixion wasn't random brutality. It was refined over centuries. The Romans studied what prolonged death, what frightened populations, what discouraged rebellion most effectively. They built systems around pain. Even geography mattered. Crosses were placed where maximum numbers of people would see them. Hillsides, city entrances, busy roads. The dead and dying became advertisements for obedience. And still, rebellions continued. That's the paradox haunting every empire built on fear. Terror can force submission, but it also creates desperation. The more Rome relied on cruelty to maintain order, the more hatred simmered beneath the surface. Slaves poisoned masters. Workers sabotaged estates. Entire uprisings exploded across provinces. Because no civilization, no matter how powerful, can permanently torture human beings into loyalty. Eventually the slave beside the road stopped struggling so much. This stage frightened witnesses the most. The body grows quieter near the end. Movements become smaller, slower. Breathing turns shallow and irregular. Some victims drifted in and out of consciousness. Others stared blankly ahead as shock overwhelmed the nervous system. But death itself could still arrive in different ways. Severe blood loss from flogging weakened many prisoners long before crucifixion began. Infection spread rapidly through open wounds. Exposure destroyed the body over time. Heart failure, suffocation, dehydration, shock, sometimes all at once. Ancient medicine barely understood these processes, but Roman executioners recognized the signs well enough. They knew when a man was close. Maybe rain began falling that evening. Maybe the sky burned orange across the horizon while travelers hurried home before dark. Maybe nearby soldiers laughed over dice games beneath the crosses while another human being slipped slowly out of existence above them. History doesn't preserve those final details. It rarely preserves the victims at all. That's one of the cruelest realities about ancient slavery. Millions lived and died without leaving names behind. Their labor built roads, temples, aqueducts, villas, entire cities. Yet most vanished from the historical record completely. The powerful wrote history. The crucified became warnings instead of people. But occasionally, archaeology pulls fragments back into the light. In 1968, researchers discovered the remains of a crucified man near Jerusalem. A nail still pierced the ankle bone. It remains one of the only direct archaeological pieces of evidence for Roman crucifixion ever found. One skeleton, out of countless thousands. That's all history recovered. And it reminds us something important. These weren't abstract punishments from dusty textbooks. They happened to real bodies. Real people who felt terror exactly the way we would. The slave hanging beside the road had memories. Fears. Maybe children somewhere. Maybe a language Rome mocked. Maybe dreams he stopped allowing himself to imagine years earlier. Now all of it narrowed into one desperate biological need. One more breath. Then another. Then another. Until finally the body couldn't continue. Death during crucifixion may not have looked dramatic from a distance. Sometimes victims simply stopped lifting themselves upward. The chest sagged. Breathing weakened. Minutes passed between movements. Then none came at all. And even then, the horror often continued. Roman guards occasionally left corpses hanging long after death. Families weren't always permitted to remove bodies. Public decay became part of the spectacle. A final humiliation. The empire wanted memory attached to the site, wanted fear burned permanently into anyone who passed by. But here's the strange thing about fear as a political weapon. It works. Until suddenly it doesn't. Rome appeared eternal at its height. Its armies conquered continents. Its laws shaped civilizations. Its roads connected the ancient world. Yet the same empire that crucified thousands of slaves eventually fractured, weakened, and disappeared. The crosses rotted. The roads cracked. The empire faded into history. And the people Rome considered disposable became some of the most haunting voices echoing from the ancient world. Because today, nobody admires Rome for crucifying slaves beside highways. We remember it because of the horror. Because somewhere deep down, across centuries, human beings recognize cruelty even when civilizations try to normalize it. That's what makes crucifixions so disturbing to study. Not just the physical agony, though that was unimaginable. It's the realization that ordinary societies can slowly accept almost anything if power presents it as necessary. Citizens walked past dying slaves every day. Children grew up seeing crosses. Philosophers defended it. Officials organized it. Soldiers joked beneath it. And life continued. Until eventually an empire built partly on fear became one more ruin buried beneath dust. But for one final moment, imagine that slave again. Night settling over the Roman road. The sounds of distant wagons fading. A body broken almost beyond recognition hanging beneath darkening skies. Somewhere nearby, soldiers waiting for silence. And beneath all the empire's power, all its armies, all its cruelty, one terrifying truth remained impossible for Rome to erase. The man on the cross was still human.